What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the CUPPS Analytics YouTube channel. My name is Alex CUPPS, and today I'm going to be giving you guys my main data-driven takeaways from Week 11 of the 2025 NFL season. Not gonna lie, this was one of the least enjoyable fantasy weeks for me in a long time, and the data backs that up. You can see here, this week was the lowest fantasy point total by running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends that we've had all year, pending Monday Night Football, and it definitely felt that way watching. It felt like a lot of the big names did nothing this week. There were a lot of low-scoring games, field goals, punts, pretty much everything that we're not looking for in terms of fantasy. But regardless, I'm still here and I'm still going to be giving you guys my main takeaways from this week. So buckle up, we're about to start Week 11. CUPPS Analytics Data-Driven Takeaways starts right now. Let's go. So this week, I'm thinking I'm going to switch it up a little bit in terms of the data breakdowns that I show you guys. I did come up with a new breakdown, and that stemmed from this comment that we got from Brandon on last week's video. He makes a good point that as you're getting later into the season, it becomes more indicative and there's more signal from the data that we're seeing recently rather than the data that we're seeing throughout the season as a whole. And I liked what Brandon thought of with talking about the previous month of data for the most part, and looking at the takeaways that we can look at from that rather than most of our takeaways coming from the season-long data. So we're still going to look at some of the season-long data that I show week to week, but we're also going to start off with a new breakdown where I look at the biggest risers and fallers at each of the positions, running back, wide receiver, and tight end over the past month specifically. So that's what you're seeing on the screen right here. This is my new data visualization, the biggest movers at each position, starting off here with the running backs. So you can see here that we're looking at the biggest risers and fallers, but based on their performance weeks 1 through 7, so the first 7 weeks of the season, and then the past month of data. So in this case, it would be weeks 8 to 11. And I think this chart does do a really good job of highlighting the biggest difference makers in fantasy, the players that have come on the most over the past month, along with those players on the flip side that we've seen lose their roles over the past month as well. Getting started with the running backs here, we can start with the man of the hour, Sean Tucker, who saw a pretty insane game this week for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And obviously his last 4 fantasy points per game is pretty heavily inflated by what he did this week. He had 19 carries for 106 yards and 2 touchdowns, along with 2 catches for 34 yards and another touchdown. So Tucker gets the hat trick this week against the Bills. And in terms of takeaways here, I'm not sure how much I'm reading into this Sean Tucker stuff, with Bucky Irving probably set to return next week. Bucky was apparently pretty close to actually coming back this week to face the Bills, so I would be surprised if he doesn't return next week. And with Bucky back, I'm pretty sure Sean Tucker is not going to see this same workload that he saw this week, but I do think he probably will be more of a thorn in the side of Bucky Irving's production than we'd like to think. So I definitely think he's worth a prospective add if he's still on the waiver wires, just in case Bucky does miss another week. In that case, I absolutely would be looking to fire up Sean Tucker, but I don't think you can trust him on a weekly basis if Bucky returns. The next biggest riser that we're seeing here is Devin Singletary, who's still splitting the backfield relatively evenly with Tyrone Tracy, but this week he does find the end zone twice, and he's looking to be the New York Giants' established red zone and goal line back at this point. So while I feel like Singletary's floor is pretty slim right now, considering the Giants' offense isn't super effective, and they're not going to be finding themselves on the 1-yard line for Devin Singletary to punch in those touchdowns every game. So I would personally rather look elsewhere for running back production, but there's definitely worse options out there than Singletary at this point. For the third biggest riser at the running back position, we have none other than TreVeyon Henderson out of New England, who's been seeing an absolutely massive increase in his fantasy production since Ramondre Stevenson went down. Henderson has bumped up his fantasy points per game from 6.74 to over 20, and is the running back 6 in fantasy points per game over the past month. And with Henderson, I feel like this is a pretty classic rookie bump on the back half of the season. We see this every year with the most talented rookies in the class. The production tends to be back-weighted, so that's when it matters most for fantasy, obviously, with playoffs and your championship matchups. So obviously Ramondre hasn't been active over the past couple weeks, but I would be surprised to see New England revert back to their old backfield split that they had towards the beginning of the the year, with Ramondre receiving most of the valuable touches and Henderson serving as mainly a satellite back. I think he's just shown too much at this point to take him off the field like they were at the beginning of the season. All right, similar vibes to TreVeyon Henderson. We have Chase Brown, who's obviously not a rookie, but has seen a pretty similar increase in his fantasy points per game from the first 7 weeks to what he's done over the past month. He's up from 9.7 fantasy points per game through the first 7 weeks to over 21 points, and he's currently the RB5 in that time frame. And with Chase Brown, I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that Flacco is giving a massive boost to this offense. We're seeing Chase Brown take the work back from Samaje Perine that he was giving up earlier in the season. And I see no reason as to why Chase Brown can't continue to produce like this down the stretch. So he's another guy that I'm absolutely looking at as a top 12 running back going forward. Ty Johnson over in Buffalo is kind of similar to Devin Singletary in a way where he's not someone that I would love to plug into my lineup, but I think you could definitely do worse than his production as a desperation RB2. He definitely doesn't have the same floor of carries that he's going to be getting in the backfield, but he's proven that Josh Allen loves him as a pass catching option and that he has the ability to break off massive receptions and score touchdowns. Below him, we have Samaje Perine, who I'd say I'm probably not super interested in unless we see a Chase Brown injury, but I do think he would serve as a solid Chase Brown handcuff if he's available on waivers. Brian Robinson, another guy who's probably not more than a handcuff for Christian McCaffrey, but if we were to see Christian McCaffrey go down, he would absolutely offer league-winning upside given the role that San Francisco backfield has. We also have Kareem Hunt, who's gone from a running back that you plug into your RB2 flex spot and pray that he gets into the end zone to a guy that has a little more floor than that since Isaiah Pacheco's been out. He's now up to 14.3 fantasy points per game over the last month, which is good for RB18. So as long as Pacheco remains out, I would be happy to start Kareem Hunt as a back-end RB2. Kyle Monangai's also worked his way into a mainstay of this Chicago Bears backfield rotation over the past month as well. Obviously, we had that big game where DeAndre Swift was inactive and we saw Monangai blow up for like 25, 30 fantasy points. But even this week and last week with Swift active, he does find the end zone. Ben Johnson and the Bears clearly trust him on the goal line. And I think he's another one of those back-end RB2, high-end RB3s that you could plug in on a weekly basis. RJ Harvey is an interesting one as well. He's now up to 13.1 fantasy points per game over the past month. The runway was cleared for Harvey this week with J.K. Dobbins going on season-ending IR after the previous week's game. And while we didn't see the production necessarily that we were hoping for, we did get a good idea of what his role will look like going forward. I think the expectations were a little high this week, given the fact that they were playing the stout Kansas City defense, but he had 11 of the 17 total running back carries, and he also had 3 receptions out of the backfield. So I think it's wheels up for RJ Harvey going forward. Over the next couple weeks, they have the Commanders and the Raiders, which are obviously much easier rushing matchups than the Kansas City Chiefs. And I think we're due to see some RJ Harvey blow-up games down the stretch. All right, moving down to the biggest RB fallers over the past month. Starting off with Chuba Hubbard. Talked about this last week, but with Rico Dowdle taking over the bell cow role in that Carolina backfield, we've seen Chuba Hubbard absolutely plummet over the past month. He's gone from 12.72 fantasy points per game to 4.3 over the past 4 weeks, which is good for RB49. And this isn't new news. You can't start Chuba Hubbard at this point unless we were to see Rico Dowdle get hurt. We also see Quinshon Judkins have a pretty aggressive fall over the past month. He's gone from 15.3 fantasy points per game to just around 7. And I don't think this is as big of an indictment on Quinshon Judkins as a talent as it is on the fact that defenses are just absolutely stacking the boxes to stop the run game against this Browns offense, given the fact that they're so incompetent at quarterback. So I would say to definitely temper your expectations for Quinshon Judkins down the stretch this year specifically, and just hope that the Browns can find a more competent answer at quarterback so their passing offense can be improved going forward. Jordan Mason as well, pretty much the flip side of the coin of Aaron Jones returning and taking over that Minnesota backfield. He's down from 12.4 fantasy points per game to 5.2 over the past month, and especially this week, his role has just gotten significantly worse. So I'm definitely not looking to start Jordan Mason the rest of the year unless we were to see see an Aaron Jones injury. We also have Bill, who's gone from preseason darling to forgettable RB3 over the past month. He's down from 10.6 fantasy points per game to 3.7. So just an absolute fall from grace from the rookie phenom, Jacory Croskey-Merritt. He's definitely not startable at this point and absolutely droppable in redraft formats. Speaking of guys who are droppable, I would say Tony Pollard can absolutely hit your waiver wire, down to 6.5 fantasy points per game over the past month. Ever since we saw Tyjae Spears return from IR, he's taken a large majority of the valuable running back snaps out of that Titans backfield, and there aren't a ton to go around in the first place. So given that fact that the Titans are such a poor offense and Tony Pollard is getting replaced on passing downs and in the receiving game for Tyjae Spears, I would absolutely drop Tony Pollard, and I would honestly rather start someone like a Devin Singletary going forward. The rest of the guys on this list aren't super fantasy relevant. I will note Nick Chubb down from 8.4 fantasy points to just around 5. Woody Marks has taken over that Houston backfield, so definitely wouldn't be looking to start Chubb anytime soon, and he can probably hit the waiver wire as well. All right, moving over to the biggest wide receiver movers over the past month, and we can start off with the biggest game of any wide receiver this week, none other than Michael Wilson, who has an absolutely insane game against the 49ers this week. He has 18 targets, 15 catches, 185 receiving yards. Good for 36.5 PPR points this week. He's up from just around 5 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks to over 16.5 over the past month. Granted, this average is a little bit skewed considering the Cardinals had their bye week in week 8, so his sample size is only 3 games. Regardless though, he is the wide receiver 9 over the past month. And this was super cool to see from Michael Wilson, but I will say I don't believe it truly changes the outlook of his season or his role at all down the course of the stretch. Marvin Harrison missed this game with an injury, and I'm expecting him to probably be back next week. Michael Wilson probably goes back to that role that he had previously, but that being said, even his games before this week weren't too bad at all. And I think you could probably trust him as a back-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 going forward. And I would definitely bump that up if we were to see Marvin Harrison miss another game. Next on the list, we have Pat Bryant, who has his best game as a pro so far this week. He is 3rd on the Broncos this week with 6 targets for 82 yards. And he's a rookie I'm definitely keeping my eye on down the stretch. And I would add him in redraft leagues right now if I could, because I think there is a good chance that he continues to grow his role in this Broncos offense over the most important weeks of the fantasy season. Next, and probably the biggest riser that we have amongst all the wide receivers here, is Jameson Williams, who has gone from 8.3 fantasy points over the first 7 weeks to over 20 over the past month, which is good for wide receiver 3 overall. And Jameson Williams' role has definitely taken a step forward compared to what we saw from him in the early part of the season. This week he had 7 targets, 4 catches for 88 yards, and a touchdown. And I see no reason why J-Mo can't continue to smash down the stretch, especially with Sam Laporta sidelined for the rest of the meaningful fantasy season. I will note though that I don't think his emergence in this Lions offense will have a negative impact on Amon-Ra's performance down the stretch. Obviously, looking at the box score this week, it feels in a way like J-Mo has usurped Amon-Ra on the depth chart, but I still think that couldn't be further from the truth. Amon-Ra this week had 12 targets of his own, but just couldn't get anything going with Jared Goff. So very excited for J-Mo, but I don't believe it's going to come at the expense of Amon-Ra. Another super exciting wide receiver riser that we have here is Jayden Higgins over in Houston, and he's starting to take that lead that we're looking for from rookies in the back half of the season. This week, he was just behind Nico and Dalton Schultz in terms of targets, ahead of Christian Kirk, ahead of Xavier Hutchinson, ahead of Jalen Knoll, and he had 4 catches for 55 yards. So nothing that'll blow your socks off in the box score, but it's super encouraging to see him getting more and more involved every week in this Texans offense. Mac Hollins and Tyrell Shavers are interesting names, but neither are guys that I would be looking to rely on a weekly basis, and I think they're probably better off left on the waiver wire. Jauan Jennings has been taking that step forward in the 49ers offense. He's up to 12.8 fantasy points per game over the past month. So I'm looking at him as a back-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3 going forward. Definitely someone you can plug into your lineups. Not super interested in Greg Dortch or Malik Washington, but then finishing off with T. Higgins here, one of the more interesting risers at the wide receiver position as well. He's up from 10.5 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks to just under 20 at 19.3 over the last month, which is good for wide receiver 5 overall in that time frame. And I don't think anything's really changed with T. Higgins. He's just one of those guys that will have those up and down periods throughout the season. Never someone I'm looking to take out of my lineup because you know he's due to have that 30-point blow-up game at any point. But it's absolutely been awesome to see he and Joe Flacco get on the same page over the past couple weeks. And especially with Jamar Chase being suspended for the next game, I think we could be primed to see T. Higgins with a massive week. Moving down to the biggest wide receiver fallers over the past month. And first looking at the Chargers wide receivers that we're seeing here, Keenan Allen down from just around 16 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks to 7 over the past month. Similar story with Quentin Johnston, who's down from 16.5 to just over 8 fantasy points per game over the past month. And I think both of these guys are pretty hard to trust as a weekly starter at this point. With the emergence of Oronde Gadsden as one of the most reliable targets for Justin Herbert, along with Ladd McConkey slotting right in as that dependable wide receiver 1, Keenan and QJ have both kind of taken a back seat over the past month. And while I think Keenan probably offers a more stable floor, the ceiling is definitely still there with QJ, who can get there on a weekly basis with one deep ball. But there's no doubt that they're definitely both going to be hard to trust going forward. We also have the Chiefs wide receivers, Tyquan Thornton and Hollywood Brown, who we see both come back to earth after being dependable targets for Patty over the first half of the year. They've now seen their production fall pretty drastically with the return of Rashee Rice, along with Travis Kelce becoming more and more involved down the stretch. Last guy I want to talk about here is Matthew Golden, who's gone from 8 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks to just around 3 over the last month. And this is not the direction we're looking to see these rookies go at this point in the year. Like I mentioned earlier, the rookie production, we want to be back weighted, and we want to see these rookies get more acclimated to the NFL over the season. And with Matthew Golden, it feels like it's going the wrong way. So in redraft, I would be looking to drop Matthew Golden for a guy like Jayden Higgins, for a guy like Pat Bryant, some of those other rookies that we're seeing more promising stuff from over the past month. All right, last but not least, looking at the biggest risers and fallers at the tight end position over the last month. Quick note here before we get started. If you're wondering where Oronde Gadsden is, he would absolutely be on the risers list here, but he didn't qualify considering he did not have at least 4 games played over the first 7 weeks. That being said, we do have another 2025 rookie atop the list of biggest risers at the tight end position, Colston Loveland, who's up from 3.1 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks to now 13.3 over the last month, which is good for tight end 6 overall during that time frame. And this goes back to the same point I was making about some of those wide receivers earlier and back-weighted production for rookies. This is absolutely what we're looking to see from Colston Loveland to finish off his rookie season. He has the prospect pedigree, he's showing that he can do it in the NFL, and I'm viewing him as a tight end 1 going forward. With Colby Parkinson and Davis Allen, 2 of the tight ends over on the Rams, they've both been big risers over the past month, and that's more so due to the fact that the Rams have significantly changed their offensive play style in recent weeks. They're running a lot more 12 personnel than they were earlier in the season, and as a result, we're seeing these tight ends get more involved in the passing game. That being said, I don't really view either of them as being reliable as a fantasy starter. I mean, at this point, the Rams have 4 tight ends that they're getting in on a regular basis. They have these 2, Tyler Higbee, and their rookie Terrence Ferguson, so it's nearly impossible to know who you'd want to start. Mark Andrews is a big riser over the last month as well, since we've seen Lamar Jackson return. And I think the floor with Mark Andrews is definitely more shaky than it used to be, but he still is one of Lamar's favorite targets in the red zone. And obviously we saw they can scheme up creative plays for him, given that 30+ yard rushing touchdown that he had on a fake sneak late in the game this week. So I'm viewing him as probably a back-end tight end 1 the rest of the way. Another guy I want to note on this list is the rookie Gunnar Helm over in Tennessee. And he obviously hasn't had a huge rise. He's only up to 6.6 fantasy points per game over the past month. And as you know, there's not a ton of good to say about the Tennessee passing offense right now. So Helm's not a guy that I'd be looking to pick up in redraft by any means, but definitely someone to keep your eye on if you're in Dynasty. He's had a pretty promising rookie season in terms of earning targets in this offense. And while they haven't really amounted to much considering the fact that this offense is so terrible, I'm really interested to see what he can get going next year when they have a consistent coaching staff and hopefully a better passing attack as well. Moving down to the tight end fallers over the past month, and no secret that the biggest one, Jake Ferguson, who after his insane start to the year, 17.2 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks, is down to just a measly 5 fantasy points per game over the past month. And I'm definitely eating my words from what I said about Jake Ferguson earlier in the year. I was calling him a candidate for the tight end 1 overall, based on what we were seeing his role was looking like with CD out, and I did not expect it to have this much of a whiplash with CD returning. I still think he's probably a back-end tight end 1 the rest of the way, but definitely a fall from grace from what we were seeing over the first half of the year. Hunter Henry, another guy who's had a pretty big fall, down from 10.4 fantasy points per game to just around 6.8. And we're just seeing more options get involved in this New England passing offense, and hard to trust really anyone other than Stephon Diggs as a reliable weekly option. Last name I'll talk about is Kyle Pitts, who's down from around 11 fantasy points per game over the first 7 weeks to just around 8 over the past month. We've started to see his role deteriorate a little bit with Mooney returning into the fold, and I don't expect it to get any better with Michael Penix landing on season-ending IR and Kirk Cousins back at QB. And we'll finish off here with one of the charts that I show every week, the top 24 running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends sorted by expected fantasy points per game over the first 11 weeks of the season. And for those of you that are new here, you can see that the blue bars here represent expected fantasy points per game, which is a metric from PFF that basically looks at players' usage and roles on their respective offenses and determines how many fantasy points they were expected for in a given week. In our case, we're taking that expected fantasy point per game value and averaging it over the first 11 weeks of the season. So this chart gives us a good idea of who's overperforming and underperforming their expected roles in their offense. We have the green dots here showing us overperformers, and you can see, for example, Christian McCaffrey's expected fantasy points per game is 24.6, and he's actually scoring 25.8 fantasy points per game, so he's slightly overperforming his expected role. On the flip side, someone like Chase Brown is expected for 16.08 fantasy points per game, and he's underperforming that by just around 3 fantasy points per game at 13.2. Kind of going back to what I was saying earlier in the video, once we get to this point in the season where the sample size is so big in terms of the games that have been played, we don't really see a ton of movement on charts like these that look at the season-long production. So I'm not going to dive too much into many of the names here that we're seeing, but I will scroll down to show you guys how the top 24 looks right now. Moving down to the top 24 wide receivers by expected fantasy points per game, Ja'Marr Chase, who was previously our only wide receiver over 20 expected fantasy points per game, has now fallen. He's down to 19.59 expected fantasy points per game, slightly underperforming that by 0.02. So he's pretty much right on expectation. And then one name that we've seen fall drastically down this chart over the past couple of weeks is Puka Nacka, who's down here at wide receiver 9 in expected fantasy points per game at this point. So he's gone all the way from being up here at the top at wide receiver 1 to around the middle, mid wide receiver 1, around wide receiver 4 and 5, now down to wide receiver 9 at this point. So do I expect to see Puka regress back to this 16.5 or so fantasy points per game down the stretch? No, I do not. I think he's going to continue to provide higher end wide receiver 1 production, but I definitely think we might see him finish as more around that wide receiver 4 or 5 overall. And it's definitely a pretty big fall considering the difference making production, the legendary production that we were seeing from him over the first half of the season when he was averaging anywhere around 25, 26 points per game. One guy I did want to highlight as well was Tetairoa McMillan, the rookie over in Carolina, who has an absolutely massive game, his best of his pro career so far. He has 8 catches for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns this week. And going back to what I was saying earlier, again, that rookie back-weighted production is crucial. And with a prospect like Tetairoa McMillan that we know to be elite at this point, he's looked every bit the part of an alpha wide receiver 1 at the NFL level this whole year. And we finally get to see it hit the box score. So we absolutely love to see it. I'll be starting Tetairoa McMillan every week down the stretch. And I think we continue to see him evolve into a difference-making wide receiver 1 in fantasy. And I'll scroll down to let you guys see the remainder of the top 24 at the wide receiver position. All right, finishing off with the top 24 tight ends by expected fantasy points per game. And man, I cannot get enough of watching Trey McBride play football. There are only 6 wide receivers averaging more fantasy points per game up to this point in the year than Trey McBride. Jackson Smith-Njigba, Puka Nacka, Drake London, Ja'Marr Chase, Rashee Rice, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. This is the type of upside that we are talking about when we talk about cheat code production from the tight end position. Trey McBride is playing like an elite wide receiver 1, and you get to put him in your tight end spot in fantasy. Just absolutely legendary stuff from the guy. Jacoby Brissett has unlocked a different beast, one that I don't think we ever would have seen if Kyler Murray hadn't gotten hurt, and I'm not complaining. Absolutely love to see it. McBride is looking like a league winner. Also wanted to call out Dalton Schultz, who is the tight end 6 in expected fantasy points per game. He's the only one in the top 6 that's underperforming. Expected for 11.3 fantasy points per game. He's at 10.6 actual. And he's a guy I'm plugging into my lineup every week. He's proven to have a super solid floor in this Texans offense, along with a pretty high ceiling as well. And I'll just scroll down here to show you guys the rest of the top 24 tight ends as well. All right, that's all I have this week for week 11 of my biggest data-driven takeaways. Let me know what you guys thought of the new format, the new data visualizations. I'm trying to make this video as concise as I can and hopefully not just be the same data with slight differences every week, which is kind of how it can get once we get this late into the season. So trying to keep this actionable for you guys. I'll keep trying to think of other ways that I can improve the takeaways from this video over the last couple weeks. And let me know if you guys have any ideas as well. Drop a comment below, and I'd love to come up with some new stuff for you guys. But that's all I have for this week. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, help us reach 100 subscribers. I think we only need 4 or 5 more, so go ahead and subscribe below. I'll be back every Tuesday for the remainder of the season. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.